Welcome to PC David here, and today I'm going to take you through a complete edit in Darkroom to hopefully give you some ideas, give you some knowledge, maybe even inspire you and help you create the photos you want. Now, Darkroom is available on 3 different devices: the iPhone, the iPad and the Mac. And for this tutorial I'm going to be using my Mac simply because it has a bigger screen, which will be better for the tutorial. But since Darkroom for Mac was created using Mac Catalyst, it works pretty much the same way as the iPhone and iPad versions, so you should be able to follow along on any device and get the same results. Let's get started. So the photo I'm going to be editing is this one of this horse taken on my iPhone 12 Pro with Halide Mark II at sunrise on a walk a few days ago. Here's the before and here's the after. And before I start editing, I want to quickly take a look at my metadata so you can understand exactly why I chose the settings I did and how those settings are going to help us while editing. So I'm at ISO 25 and I always use the lowest ISO for image quality reasons. An aperture of f2 because it's fixed on the iPhone, nothing I can do about that. And finally a shutter speed of 1/68th of a second. And in this situation, anything faster than 1/68th would have underexposed the horse even more, and anything slower would have overexposed the sky even more. So it's all about shooting with the iPhone's dynamic range in mind and finding the right balance. Now, according to the histogram, even though it doesn't look like it, there should be detail in the sky. So let's press number 3 on the keyboard to open up the adjustments panel and bring the exposure down and have a look. Yep, I can see there is information there. So my goal is to bring back the highlights in the sky while maintaining a good exposure on the horse and the foreground, which is more in the shadows, as you can see in both the histogram and in the photo itself. The histogram is also showing me that if I bring the exposure down, I'll have enough information in the shadows to bring those up and balance the exposure. So if I do that, yeah, that's great. And at ISO 25 we haven't introduced too much noise. But what about the highlights? Well, in Darkroom the highlights don't work the same way as they do in, say, Adobe Lightroom. And in this photo, as you can see in the histogram, there's hardly any highlights at all at the moment. So bringing down the highlights really shouldn't do anything. In fact, it just introduces this weird fringing that you get in Darkroom. So the first thing I'll do is I want to focus on the exposure slider, and I'm going to bring the exposure down to start recovering that sky. And I'm going to bring it down to the point where I can actually start to see some highlights. About there at -144 looks pretty good. And now that our blown out sky is showing some information, I can carry on recovering it in the highlights. As I bring them down, you can see more yellow, more blue in the sky, but I don't want to bring the highlights down too much because it can look a little HDR, a little fake, and again you get this weird banding here. So -64 I think is great. But now our horse is underexposed, so I'm going to bring the shadows up. I want to bring the horse back to where it started, so if I hold down the backslash key I can see what the horse looked like. So I think 62 looks pretty good. But now the image is a lot less contrasty. This is where a clarity slider would be useful to just add some contrast to these midtones here in the grass. But nonetheless, a great tool for adding contrast to midtones is the curves panel. I'm going to leave the contrast slider for now until after I see what happens in the curves panel, because if I add contrast then the overall image will increase in contrast and it will get darker, which I don't want. This tutorial, by the way, is all my own work, no input whatsoever from the developers Berg & Co. So they could add a brand new tool tomorrow or take one away that ruins this whole thing. Anyway, so I'm going to press the number 4 key to open the curves panel. In the curves panel I can bring up the midtones to reintroduce some contrast, but I don't want to bring them up too much because again you get this weird banding, and I think +54 is enough to bring some nice contrast back to the grass there. And if I click this eye up here you can see what effect this has had. I also want to create a sense of atmosphere that was actually present when I took the photo, and to do that I can bring up our blacks ever so slightly just to fade them. I think around 7% looks pretty good. And I can bring the shadows down to balance that out, which leaves us with this faded atmospheric foreground. It's meant that we've lost some of the details in the horse's coat, the horse's jacket, I don't know, but I can bring back some of those later, maybe with some sharpening. Before I leave the curves panel, I just want to make the edges of these fine branches a bit less harsh against the sky, and to do that I can fade the whites ever so slightly. So here's an exaggerated look. Obviously that's too much, so I'll leave them around, I think, 94% or 96% maybe. Yeah, so we've made some great progress with the curves panel. Next, I want to focus on these colours. I want to bring out the colours in the sky, so I'm going to press the number 5 key to open up the HSL panel. And let's start with these orangey yellows over here. So if I bring the orange hue slider all the way up to plus 100, you can see on the side of itself that's going to make the oranges more yellow. So we don't want that. I want to go the other way. Let's go to around -70, -75. And I can make them pop a little bit more by increasing the saturation. But one of the key sliders is going to be the luminance. -100 really exaggerates that orange glow, but again, I want to avoid that weird banding, so I'm going to bring it up until I can't see it anymore. And I think -18 is, it's borderline, but it looks alright. And I do just want to take a bit more yellow out of the sky, so I'll bring the hue in the yellows across to about -18, -20. Finally, I also like the greens to be less turquoise and more towards the yellow side, so I'll move them over too. -68 I think looks pretty good. So let's hold the backslash key again. So that's where we started, and this is how it's going, and I'm really happy with that so far. Next, I want to bring some of the blues back in the sky, and to do that I'm not actually going to touch any blues in the HSL panel. Instead, I'm going to remove some red from the highlights, and to do that I can press 4 to go back to the curves panel and then over to the R in RGB, which is the reds. And helpfully Darkroom is telling us what's going to happen if we move these sliders around. So down here we have blues, and up here we have reds, and it's the same with all three colours. We've also got green and purple and blue and yellow. So over here in the red channel, when I take some reds out of the highlights by just bringing it to about 66, yep, our sky turns more blue. Basically all the highlights in the red channel are affected, and it has removed some of the oranges here in the sky, but that is a sacrifice I'm willing to make. So these individual color channels in the curves panel are really powerful. This is the place that you come to, for example, if you wanted to, say, make your shadows red or green or something like that. Actually, I think adding some red to the shadows will look pretty good. But I don't want to do it here. Let's jump over to split toning, which is back in the adjustments panel at the bottom. So I'm going to go into the shadows and the split toning, and I'm going to increase the amount to around 8 or 9, not so much, I think 6. Yeah, so I can move the color slider anywhere I want and introduce a different color to the shadows. And I love the fact that how the reds are contrasting really nicely against the blue highlights in the sky, and it works really well with these greens and these browns down here. And it's given the horse like a nice color to it as well. So I think I'm going to leave that there. And since we're back in the adjustments panel, let's just do some polishing just to finish off. So we can introduce a fair chunk of sharpness to this fairly soft raw file, I think 23. We can add a very subtle vignette to frame the horse a little bit more, not too much. A bit of a fade, I think, because it's 2020 and fade is cool. And let's increase the overall vibrance and saturation, because bring some colour to winter, why not? So I think that looks pretty good. We don't need any more contrast in this photo at all, so I'll leave that contrast slider after all. So just to finish off, I'll just straighten it slightly, and when I'm in Darkroom I can't not add one of these insets, so I'll do that. And that's it. We can now save our edits as a filter. We can create a new filter to be used instantly again in the future. So here's our before, and here's the after. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, I have lots more Darkroom content in the form of a full workflow tutorial and 2 full reviews. So you can go ahead and enjoy those. But from me today, thank you so much for watching. Take care, stay curious, and Aussie Buna.